In a small Pennsylvania town, a single father working 3 jobs to keep a roof over his daughter's head made a choice that would change everything. Dan Cooper had exactly 47 minutes to complete a repair job. That would cover his rent, when he spotted an elderly woman standing alone at a bus stop. Confusion was written across her weathered face as the temperature dropped toward freezing. Everyone else walked past her like she was invisible. But Dan stopped. He didn't know that the lost, frightened woman, clutching a tattered purse, was Beatrice Thornton, the reclusive billionaire whose family foundation owned half the businesses in town, including the very apartment building where Dan faced eviction. He didn't know that her mind was slipping away piece by piece, or that her son had written her off as a burden. All Dan knew was that someone needed help, and despite having nothing to spare, he gave everything he had. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The November wind in Morning Glory, Pennsylvania, carried the kind of cold that seemed to seep through every layer of clothing, settling deep in your bones and staying there long after you'd found shelter. Street lamps flickered on early against the gray afternoon sky, casting weak pools of yellow light on sidewalks already dusted with the first hints of winter. Most folks hurried past with their heads down, breath visible in small puffs as they made their way home from work, eager to escape the biting air. Dan Cooper pulled his worn denim jacket tighter around his shoulders as he jogged down Pine Street, his work boots splashing through shallow puddles left from the morning's freezing rain. His toolbox rattled in his left hand, while his right clutched a crumpled piece of paper with an address and a phone number. Mrs. Peterson's kitchen sink had backed up again, and she'd called him in a panic about water spreading across her floor. It was the 3rd emergency call this week, and if he could fix it before 6, the $60 would be enough to cover what he still owed on rent. The math played over and over in his head as he walked. 47 minutes to get to Elm Street, diagnose the problem, fix it, collect payment, and get back to Riverside Apartments before Mrs. Jackson locked up the office. 47 minutes to keep Zoe from having to sleep in Rick's garage again. 47 minutes to maintain what little stability his 8-year-old daughter had left in her world. The bus stop at Pine and 3rd sat in the shadow of Morning Glory's old brick library, a weathered bench beneath a rusted shelter that provided little protection from the elements. Dan had passed this spot hundreds of times over the years, usually without giving it much thought. But today, something made him slow his pace. An elderly woman stood beside the bench, not sitting, just standing perfectly still in a way that looked wrong somehow. She wore a long beige coat that had seen better decades, and her silver hair escaped from beneath a knitted hat that might have been white once, but had faded to the color of old snow. Her hands gripped a brown leather purse so tightly her knuckles showed white through papery skin. Dan glanced at his watch. 44 minutes now. He needed to keep moving, needed to get to Mrs. Peterson's before the hardware store closed. And he couldn't get the parts he might need. But the woman turned slightly, and he caught sight of her face. Her eyes held a look he recognized. The same confused fear Zoe had worn on her first day at a new school, when they'd moved apartments for the 3rd time in 2 years. The woman looked up the street, then down it, then up again. Her mouth moved slightly, forming words Dan couldn't hear over the wind. She took a step toward the curb, hesitated, then stepped back. A middle-aged man in a business suit walked past her without slowing down. A woman with grocery bags shifted them to one arm to check her phone, never lifting her eyes. Two teenagers laughed loudly as they passed, their conversation about weekend plans continuing uninterrupted. Dan stopped walking entirely. The woman noticed him looking and offered a small, uncertain smile that seemed to apologize for existing. "Excuse me?" he called out, his voice carrying across the few yards between them. "Are you all right?" She blinked several times as if trying to bring him into focus. "I think I might have missed my bus," she said, her voice soft and unsteady. "Or perhaps it hasn't come yet. I'm not quite sure about the time." Dan approached slowly, the way he would with a lost animal that might bolt if startled. "What bus are you waiting for?" "The number 12, I believe. Or was it the 14? She opened her purse and began rummaging through it with increasing agitation. "I have my schedule somewhere. I always keep it right here, but nothing seems to be where I left it anymore." The contents of her purse spilled slightly as she searched. Dan caught sight of tissues, a small coin purse, reading glasses in a cracked case, and what looked like several business cards held together with a rubber band. No bus schedule, no wallet that he could see, no phone. "Where are you trying to get to?" he asked gently. She looked up at him with eyes that were sharp one moment and clouded the next. "Home," she said simply. "I just want to go home, but I can't seem to remember." Her voice trailed off, and she looked around as if seeing the street for the first time. Dan checked his watch again. 41 minutes. Mrs. Peterson was probably watching water spread across her kitchen floor right now, wondering where the handyman she'd called was. The $60 he needed was slipping away with every passing second. But this woman looked so lost, so fragile, standing there in the cold wind. "Do you remember your address?" he asked. She brightened slightly. "Oh, yes. I live on Beacon Hill. Such a lovely view from the windows. Robert always said it was the finest view in all of Pennsylvania." Her expression grew sad. "Though Robert isn't with us anymore." Dan knew the area. It was the wealthy section of Morning Glory where the old families lived behind iron gates and tall hedges. The houses up there probably cost more than Dan would make in 10 lifetimes. This woman didn't look wealthy, though. Her coat was clean, but old, her shoes sensible, but worn. Maybe she worked up there, a housekeeper or caretaker. "That's quite a ways from here," Dan said carefully. "The buses don't run up to Beacon Hill very often, especially not this late in the day." "Oh." She looked so disappointed that Dan felt something twist in his chest. "I suppose I'll have to call someone then, though I'm not sure who." She opened her purse again and began the same fruitless search. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the pavement and making the woman shiver despite her coat. Dan thought about Zoe, probably sitting at Rebecca Parker's kitchen table right now, doing homework and wondering when her dad would pick her up. Rebecca only watched her until 6:30, and she had her own family to worry about. "Ma'am, do you have any identification with you? Something with your address on it?" She patted her coat pockets, then looked in her purse again. "I must have left my wallet at home. I do that sometimes lately. Things slip my mind." She looked up at him with sudden clarity. "You're very kind to help me. Most people just walk by as if I'm not even here." Dan's throat tightened. 38 minutes now. But he couldn't leave her here. Not when the temperature was dropping and she had no way to get home. He pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Peterson. "Mrs. Peterson, it's Dan Cooper. I'm running a little behind, but I should be there within the hour. Can you hold off until then?" He listened to her response, his stomach sinking. "I understand. Yes, if you need to call someone else, I understand completely." He hung up and stared at the phone for a moment. $60. Gone. Along with his own chance to make rent on time. "Is everything all right, dear?" the woman asked, noticing his expression. Dan forced a smile. "Everything's fine. Let me help you get home." He looked around, thinking. No buses, no taxi service in Morning Glory, and he didn't have money for the one-car service that operated out of the next town over. But Rick's garage was only 3 blocks away, and Rick owed him a favor. "Stay right here for just a minute. Okay, I'm going to arrange a ride for you." Her face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Oh, you don't have to do that. I couldn't ask you to go to such trouble." "It's no trouble at all," Dan said, already dialing Rick's number. "Rick, it's Dan. I need a huge favor. There's an elderly woman stranded at the Pine Street bus stop, and she needs to get up to Beacon Hill. Could you possibly—" He listened, hope fading. "I see. No, I understand. Thanks anyway." Rick's truck was in pieces in the garage bay, and his wife had taken their car to pick up the kids from daycare. Dan looked at the woman who was watching him with the patient expression of someone used to disappointment, but still hoping for the best. The wind gusted harder, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself. In the distance, Dan could see the first snowflakes beginning to fall, tiny white specks that would soon accumulate on the cold ground. He thought about Zoe waiting for him, about the rent money he'd just lost, about the very real possibility that they'd be looking for a new place to live by the end of the week. Then he looked at the woman's face again, at the way she stood so straight, despite her obvious confusion, maintaining her dignity even as the world seemed to have forgotten she existed. "Ma'am," he said, making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "I'm going to walk you home. It's going to take a while, but I'll make sure you get there safely." Her eyes filled with tears. "You would do that for a stranger?" "You're not a stranger," Dan said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "You're someone who needs help, and that's enough." As they began walking toward Beacon Hill, neither of them knowing it would take nearly 2 hours to reach her destination, they couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would matter more than any plumbing repair ever could. Behind them, the bus stop grew smaller in the gathering dusk, and ahead lay a journey that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The snow fell steadier now, fat flakes that clung to their shoulders and melted against their faces as Dan and Beatrice made their way through the winding streets leading away from downtown Morning Glory. What had started as a light dusting was quickly becoming the season's first real snowfall, turning the sidewalks slick and the world around them into a hushed white-wrapped cocoon. Dan shortened his stride to match Beatrice's careful steps, keeping one hand ready to steady her if she slipped. She moved with the deliberate caution of someone who understood their own fragility, but there was a determined set to her shoulders that spoke of a woman who had faced worse than a snowy evening walk. "I hope I'm not keeping you from your family," Beatrice said as they paused at a street corner, waiting for a pickup truck to roll past with its headlights cutting through the early darkness. "My daughter's being looked after," Dan replied, though he could feel his phone buzzing with what was probably a text from Rebecca, asking when he'd be by to collect Zoe. "She's safe and warm, which is what matters." Beatrix nodded thoughtfully. "What's her name?" "Zoe, she's 8. Dan found himself smiling despite their circumstances. "Smart as a whip and twice as stubborn as her old man. 8 is a wonderful age, old enough to have real conversations, young enough to still believe in magic." Beatrice's voice carried a wistful quality. "I remember when my grandson was 8. He used to build these elaborate forts in the living room using all the couch cushions and dining room chairs. Robert would pretend to be terribly annoyed, but he was always the first one to crawl inside and hear whatever grand adventure Michael had planned for the day." Something in her tone made Dan glance over at her. "Michael was your grandson." The single word hung in the cold air between them. "Car accident 3 years ago. He was 17, just learning to drive. Sometimes I still catch myself listening for his footsteps on the stairs." Dan felt the familiar ache that came with unexpected grief, the kind that reminded you how quickly everything you loved could disappear. "I'm sorry. I can't imagine." It broke something in his father, in Andrew. Beatrice pulled her coat tighter as they turned onto a street lined with older houses, their windows glowing warmly against the snowy evening. "We used to be close, Andrew and I. But after Michael died, he seemed to blame me for something. Or maybe he just couldn't bear to look at me because I reminded him too much of what we'd lost." They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, their footsteps muffled by the accumulating snow. Dan found himself stealing glances at his companion, trying to reconcile her obvious refinement with her current situation. She spoke like someone educated, carried herself with the bearing of a woman accustomed to respect. Yet here she was, wandering alone and confused with no way to get home. "Beatrice," he said carefully, "forgive me for asking, but do you live alone up on Beacon Hill?" She was quiet for so long that Dan began to worry he'd overstepped. When she finally answered, her voice was smaller than before. "There's Rebecca. She's my helper. I suppose you'd call her that, though I prefer to think of her as a friend. She makes sure I take my medications and helps me remember appointments. Sometimes she helps me remember other things, too." "Does she know you're out here?" "I told her I was going for a walk. I often walk in the afternoons when the weather's nice. But today I kept walking, and somehow I ended up downtown, and then I couldn't quite remember which direction led home." She paused, looking around at the unfamiliar neighborhood. "I seem to get turned around more often lately. Rebecca says it's normal at my age, but it's frightening when you can't trust your own mind." Dan's phone buzzed again. This time he pulled it out and saw 3 missed texts from Rebecca Parker and 1 from Mrs. Jackson at his apartment building. His stomach dropped as he read Mrs. Jackson's message. "Office closes at 6. Need payment by then or locks change tomorrow morning." It was already past 6:30. "Everything all right?" Beatrix asked, noticing his expression. Dan forced a smile and put the phone away. "Just work stuff. Nothing that can't wait." They continued climbing the gentle slope that led toward Beacon Hill, passing through a middle-class neighborhood where children's bicycles sat abandoned on front lawns and jack-o'-lanterns still grinned from porches. The snow was coming down harder now, and Dan could see Beatrice was tiring despite her efforts to keep up. Would you like to rest for a minute? He suggested as they approached a small park with a covered pavilion. That might be wise, she admitted, and they made their way to the shelter. Beatrice settled onto a bench with obvious relief, while Dan checked his phone again. 7 messages now? Rebecca Parker had called twice and sent increasingly worried texts. Mrs. Thornton never came back from her walk. Have you seen her? Getting really concerned now. She's never been gone this long. About to call the police. Beatrice, Dan said gently. I think someone named Rebecca is worried about you. She's been trying to find you. Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my goodness. I completely forgot to tell her where I was going. She must be beside herself with worry. She looked at Dan with sudden clarity. Do you have her number? Could we call her? Dan scrolled through the messages until he found Rebecca's contact information. He dialed, and she answered on the first ring. Rebecca Parker. Miss Parker, this is Dan Cooper. I'm with Beatrix Thornton. She's safe, and I'm walking her home right now. The relief in Rebecca's voice was palpable. Oh, thank God. Mrs. Thornton, are you all right? Dan handed the phone to Beatrice, who took it with slightly shaking hands. Rebecca, dear, I'm so sorry. I went for a walk and got completely turned around. This lovely young man found me and is helping me get home. Where are you now? Rebecca's voice was loud enough for Dan to hear. Beatrice looked around uncertainly. I'm not quite sure, Dan. Where are we? Maple Park. Near 7th Street, Dan said, leaning closer to the phone. That's at least a mile from home, and it's snowing hard, Rebecca said. Mrs. Thornton, can you wait there? I'll come get you. Actually, Dan interjected, we're making good progress. It might be easier if we just continue on foot. The roads are getting slippery for driving. There was a pause before Rebecca responded. Mr. Cooper, I appreciate what you're doing, but Mrs. Thornton has some health conditions that make walking long distances inadvisable. If you could just stay where you are. I'm perfectly fine, Rebecca, Beatrice said with a touch of her earlier dignity. A little cold, perhaps, but Dan is taking excellent care of me. We'll be home soon. After some back and forth, Rebecca reluctantly agreed to meet them halfway at the entrance to the Beacon Hill neighborhood. Dan helped Beatrice to her feet, and they continued their journey through the increasingly snowy evening. You didn't have to do that, Beatrice said, as they walked. Insist on continuing, I mean. Rebecca could have picked me up. I said I'd walk you home, and I meant it, Dan replied. Besides, I'm enjoying the company. And surprisingly, he was. Despite the cold and the snow and the growing certainty that he'd lost his apartment, there was something peaceful about this walk with a woman who asked thoughtful questions and listened to his answers as if they mattered. When was the last time someone had asked him about Zoe and actually wanted to hear the details? When had anyone cared about his dreams or his struggles beyond how they might benefit from his labor? Tell me about your work, Beatrice said as they navigated around a particularly slippery patch of sidewalk. I fix things, mostly plumbing, electrical work, carpentry when I can get it. Whatever people need and are willing to pay for. Dan paused, then added, It's not steady, but it's honest work, and I'm good at it. I'm sure you are. You have capable hands. She gestured toward his work-worn fingers. And you think before you act. Those are valuable qualities. Not valuable enough, apparently, Dan said before he could stop himself. What do you mean? Dan hesitated, then found himself telling this near stranger about the constant juggling act of his life. The 3 part-time jobs that never quite added up to enough money. The apartment he was about to lose. The fear that kept him awake at night, wondering if he was failing Zoe by not being able to provide the stability she deserved. And tonight, by helping her. "You've made your situation worse," Beatrice said quietly. "No," Dan said firmly. "Tonight I did the right thing. Sometimes that costs more than you can afford, but you do it anyway." They had reached the foot of Beacon Hill now, where the modest houses of the lower neighborhoods gave way to larger properties set back from the road behind stone walls and wrought iron fences. Street lamps here were farther apart, but more elegant, casting pools of light that turned the falling snow into something magical. A car approached from up the hill, its headlights sweeping across them as it pulled to the curb. A woman in her 30s got out, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Mrs. Thornton, there you are. I've been so worried." Rebecca Parker was tall and athletic-looking, with short brown hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She moved quickly to Beatrice's side, checking her over with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for others. "I'm perfectly fine, Rebecca. Just a little adventure, that's all." Beatrix turned to Dan with a warm smile. "This is Dan Cooper, the gentleman who rescued me from my own confusion." Rebecca extended a hand to Dan, her grip firm and grateful. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Cooper. When she didn't come home by dark, I was imagining all sorts of terrible scenarios." "Anyone would have done the same," Dan said, though they all knew that wasn't true. "Let's get you inside and warmed up," Rebecca said to Beatrice. She looked at Dan. "Can I give you a ride somewhere?" "It's the least I can do." Dan was about to accept when Beatrice spoke up. "Nonsense. Dan is coming in for tea and something warm to eat. I insist." She looked at him with an expression that brooked no argument. "It's the very least I can do to repay your kindness." Rebecca looked uncertain. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm not sure." "I'm sure," Beatrice said with quiet authority. "Dan, I won't hear any protests. You've spent your evening taking care of me, and now it's my turn to take care of you." As they walked up the winding driveway toward a house that emerged from the snowy darkness like something from a fairy tale, Dan felt as if he was stepping into a different world entirely. Behind them, the lights of morning glory twinkled in the valley below, and ahead lay answers to questions he hadn't even known he should be asking. The Thornton house rose from the snowy landscape like a monument to a different era. Its Georgian colonial architecture spoke of old money and established roots. Warm light spilled from tall windows onto manicured grounds, where ancient oak trees stood sentinel against the winter sky. Dan had driven past places like this before when doing odd jobs in the better neighborhoods, but he'd never imagined walking through the front door as a guest. Rebecca produced a set of keys and led them up the brick steps to a heavy wooden door adorned with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The entrance hall beyond took Dan's breath away. A crystal chandelier cast prisms of light across marble floors, while an elegant staircase curved upward to a second floor that seemed to stretch on forever. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, and fresh flowers arranged in a crystal vase filled the air with the scent of roses, despite the season. "Good heavens, it's cold in here," Beatrice said, unwrapping her scarf with fingers that trembled slightly from more than just the temperature. "Rebecca, could you ask James to check the heating system?" It shouldn't be this chilly inside. Rebecca and Dan exchanged a glance. Mrs. Thornton, Rebecca said gently, James isn't here. He lives in Philadelphia now, remember? I'll adjust the thermostat myself. A shadow crossed Beatrice's face. Confusion mixed with something that looked like grief. Of course. I don't know why I said that. She turned to Dan with visible effort to refocus. Please let me take your coat. You must be frozen through. Dan hesitated, suddenly aware of how his worn work clothes and scuffed boots looked in these elegant surroundings. Maybe I should just head home. I don't want to impose. Absolutely not. Beatrice's voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to having her wishes respected. You've done me an enormous kindness, and I intend to return it properly. Rebecca appeared at his elbow, her manner professionally warm. She's right, Mr. Cooper. Please let me take your jacket, and don't worry about your boots. These floors have seen much worse than a little snow. As Rebecca led them toward what she called the sitting room, Dan caught glimpses of other spaces that seemed to go on forever. A dining room with a table that could seat 20 people, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a ladder on wheels. Through another doorway, he spotted what looked like a music room with a grand piano positioned near tall windows. The sitting room itself was more intimate than the entrance hall, but no less impressive. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace large enough for Dan to stand upright inside, while comfortable chairs and sofas were arranged to take advantage of both the warmth and the view of the gardens beyond. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and the walls displayed what Dan suspected were original paintings, not prints. Please sit wherever you're comfortable, Beatrice said, settling into a wing-back chair near the fire. Rebecca, could you bring us some tea, and perhaps some of those sandwiches you made earlier? Of course. Rebecca paused at the doorway. Mrs. Thornton, have you taken your evening medications yet? I don't believe so, though. Honestly, I'm not entirely certain what day it is, let alone what pills I've taken. Beatrice laughed, but there was an edge of frustration in it. This getting old business is more complicated than anyone tells you when you're young. After Rebecca left, uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Dan found himself studying his hostess more carefully in the firelight. Despite her earlier confusion and the obvious signs of age, there was something regal about the way she held herself. A natural grace that spoke of a lifetime of confidence and authority. This is quite a place, he said finally. It's been in Robert's family for nearly a century, Beatrice replied, following his gaze around the room. Sometimes I feel like I'm just borrowing it, even after all these years. Robert inherited it from his father, who built most of the additions you see now. The original house was much smaller. How long have you lived here? 43 years. Come March. Robert brought me here as a bride, and I was terrified I'd break something expensive just by walking through the rooms. She smiled at the memory. I grew up in a row house in South Philadelphia. My father worked in the shipyards, and my mother took in sewing to make ends meet. This place might as well have been Buckingham Palace to me. Dan leaned forward, intrigued. How did you meet Robert? At a church social, of all places. I was working as a secretary at an insurance company, and a friend dragged me along to some fundraiser her church was hosting. Robert was there because his mother had insisted. Apparently, the Thornton family was expected to make an appearance at such events. Beatrix's eyes grew distant. He was so handsome in his Navy uniform. He'd just returned from overseas, and he had this way of looking at you like you were the only person in the room who mattered. Rebecca returned with a tea service that probably cost more than Dan made in a month, along with a tray of delicate sandwiches and what looked like homemade cookies. She poured for all three of them with practiced efficiency, then discreetly placed a small pill organizer beside Beatrix's cup. "Thank you, dear," Beatrice said, taking the pills without argument. "Rebecca takes wonderful care of me. I don't know what I'd do without her." "How long have you been working for Mrs. Thornton?" Dan asked Rebecca as she settled into her own chair with a cup of tea. 3 years now," Rebecca replied. "I was working at the hospital when Mrs. Thornton's doctor recommended she might benefit from some in-home assistance. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she had adjusted to some new medications. But we seemed to suit each other well." "Rebecca's far too modest," Beatrice interjected. "She has a master's degree in social work and could be running her own agency by now. Instead, she's stuck here with an old woman who can't remember what day it is half the time." "I happen to like my job," Rebecca said firmly. "Besides, someone has to make sure you don't wander off in snowstorms." They shared a laugh, and Dan could see the genuine affection between the two women. It was more than just a professional relationship. There was real caring there, the kind that developed when people looked after each other through difficult times. "Dan," Beatrice said, turning her attention back to him. "Tell me about your daughter Zoe, was it?" Dan's face lit up the way it always did when someone asked about Zoe. "She's amazing, tough as nails, but still believes in fairy tales. She wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up, or maybe a teacher, or possibly a professional ice cream taster. She changes her mind about once a week." "And her mother?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Dan took a sip of tea, buying time. "Angela left when Zoe was 4. She found someone who could offer her a more stable life, and I couldn't argue with her reasoning. I was working construction then, gone 12 hours a day, struggling to keep up with bills. She tried to take Zoe with her, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The judge decided Zoe was better off with me." "That must have been difficult for everyone involved," Beatrice said, with genuine sympathy. "It was. But Zoe's a resilient kid. She's adjusted better than I have, probably." Dan smiled. "She still talks to her mom on the phone sometimes, but she's never asked to go live with her. I count that as a win." "Where is Zoe tonight?" Rebecca asked. "With a neighbor who watches her after school. Mrs. Parker." Dan paused, realizing the coincidence. "Actually, she has the same last name as you, Rebecca. Anyway, she keeps Zoe until I get off work, helps her with homework, feeds her dinner. I don't know what I'd do without her generosity. People who care for children often have the biggest hearts," Beatrice observed. "It takes special people to open their homes to someone else's family." As if summoned by their conversation, Dan's phone rang. Rebecca Parker's name appeared on the screen. "I should take this," Dan said apologetically. "Mrs. Parker, I'm so sorry I'm late. I got caught up helping someone." "And Dan, honey, it's fine," came Rebecca Parker's warm voice. "Zoe's already had dinner and finished her homework. She's watching a movie with my kids, but I am getting a little worried about you with this snow coming down. Are you somewhere safe?" Dan looked around the elegant sitting room, feeling surreal. "Yeah, I'm safe. I'm actually up on Beacon Hill with the lady I helped. I should be home in an hour or so." "Beacon Hill? My goodness, that's fancy. Well, don't worry about Zoe. She can stay here tonight if the roads get too bad. Just text me when you get home safe. After Dan hung up, Beatrice was studying him with renewed interest. You have good people looking out for you, she said. I'm lucky that way. Mrs. Parker has been a lifesaver since we moved to that neighborhood. She refuses to take much money for watching Zoe, says she's happy to help a working parent. And yet, you're struggling financially, Beatrice observed gently. Forgive me if I'm overstepping, but earlier you mentioned missing a job tonight that would have helped with rent money. Dan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It's not your fault. I made the choice to help you instead of rushing off to fix someone's sink. I knew what I was doing, but now you're in a difficult position because of that choice. I'll figure something out. I always do. Dan's voice was steady, but Rebecca noticed the tension in his shoulders. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. Dan, may I ask you something personal? Sure. What would you do if money weren't an issue? If you could provide Zoe with everything she needed without constantly worrying about the next paycheck? Dan considered the question seriously. I go back to school, probably get my contractor's license, maybe start my own business. I'm good with my hands, good at solving problems, but right now I can barely keep up with survival, let alone planning for the future. And Zoe, what would change for her? Everything, Dan said without hesitation. Better schools, maybe music lessons. She's always wanted to learn piano, a bedroom of her own, instead of sharing our one-bedroom apartment. Vacations sometimes, even if it's just camping. The chance to be a kid without worrying about whether we'll have enough money for school supplies. Beatrice nodded slowly, as if filing away his answers for future reference. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 kos. Dan realized with a start that he'd been here for over an hour, longer than he'd spent in pleasant conversation with adults in months. I should probably head home, he said reluctantly. Mrs. Parker will worry if I'm out too much longer in this weather. Of course, Beatrice said, though she looked disappointed. Rebecca, could you call a taxi for Dan? Actually, I could drive him, Rebecca offered. The roads might be getting slippery for walking. As they prepared to leave, Beatrice walked Dan to the front door, moving with careful dignity. In the entrance hall, she paused and turned to face him directly. Dan, she said, her voice carrying a weight of sincerity, I want you to know that what you did tonight, stopping to help a confused old woman when you had your own problems to worry about, that kind of kindness is rarer than you might think. You've reminded me that good people still exist in this world. You would have done the same for someone else, Dan replied. Beatrice smiled, an expression that transformed her entire face. I hope so. I truly hope so. She pressed something into his hand, a business card with elegant script. This has my phone number on it. Please don't hesitate to call if you ever need anything, and I mean anything. Dan looked down at the card. In the center, printed in simple black letters, were the words Beatrice Thornton and a phone number. Nothing else. No company name, no title, just her name. But somehow holding that card felt like holding a lifeline to a world he'd never imagined being part of. As Rebecca's car pulled away from the circular drive, Dan watched the house grow smaller in the side mirror, its windows glowing warmly against the snowy night. He had no idea that his act of simple kindness had planted a seed that would grow into something that would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. 3 days after the snowstorm, Dan stood outside the locked door of his former apartment, holding 2 suitcases and a cardboard box that contained everything he and Zoe owned. The eviction notice taped to the door fluttered in the morning breeze, its official language stark against the cheerful yellow paint Mrs. Jackson had used to spruce up the building the previous spring. "Daddy, why can't we go inside?" Zoe asked, tugging at his jacket with one mittened hand while clutching her stuffed elephant with the other. "We have to find a new place to live, sweetheart," Dan said, crouching down to her level. "Remember how we talked about sometimes needing to move to new adventures?" Zoe's 8-year-old wisdom saw right through his attempt at optimism. "Is it because we don't have enough money again?" The question hit Dan like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because it was completely accurate. Sometimes grown-up things are complicated, Zoe, but I promise we'll figure it out. They loaded their belongings into Rick's borrowed pickup truck and drove across town to Rick and Lisa's small house, where a fold-out couch in the living room would serve as their temporary home. Rick had insisted it was no trouble, that they were family, but Dan could see the strain it put on the young couple who were already stretching their own budget to cover Lisa's maternity leave.